and not impose, say, like a Western European bias on it. Because that automatically filters it through our filter, and then we're not getting a glimpse of what your experience is. And there's lots of different cultures, there's lots of different cultural experiences. What phenomenology attempts to do is kind of archive all of these human experiences as they are described by the people in that culture having that experience. So that's basically phenomenology. And if you think about it, that leads beautifully into existentialism, postmodernism, and deconstruction theory, where we have essentially the social construction theory that says that society is embedded in a form of life that, like Quine will talk about, it's like a web of belief. We have these internalized webs of belief that structure the way we perceive the world. And they're obviously different from one culture to another, right? But each of them has to have this web attached to the form of life, so that as experiences teach us that something conflicts with our beliefs, we have to change the web of belief in order to adapt to it, right? And so they do too, right? So all of these are, in a sense, socially constructed, because the web itself is constructed by the people in that particular culture over time. Through a dialectical process, by the way, right? The Hegelian concept of a dialogue, right? We come up with an idea. Where did hip-hop come from? Hip-hop is a music type, right?
It's a combination of more traditional, like, black soul artists with, like, rhythm.
So that's a good example of, like, a dialectical process creating it, right? So jazz, same thing. We could say, where did American jazz come from? And then it spreads to, like, Paris or something.
Mm-hmm.
They like jazz too. I can look at K-pop right now, right? They had Kim Song-un, or whatever his name is, from North Korea, applauding his. Did you see? He had his own K-pop performance.
I think I saw like someone post something about that on Facebook, but I didn't like look into it. Deeply moved by K-pop.
It's funny. That is a funny way to describe it.
Wow.
Well, have you ever seen the K-pop singers?
Yeah, it's just funny to say deeply moved. Yeah, that wasn't the like impression that I got.
No.
I think K-pop is deeply moving.
Yeah.
Weird.
Teach their own though. Maybe he's just an emotional guy.
Yeah. It's just,
Finally here tonight, how do you deal with a belligerent neighbor that constantly
Popular music. Known here as K-pop and worth nearly $5 billion a year. And this is how they say hello to their legions of fans.
We're giving them the performance and with all of the cool dance moves, and it's really energetic.
It's also an unlikely weapon against North Korea, where K-pop is reportedly banned. The South Korean military blasts music across the border to let North Koreans know what they're missing. South Korean pop culture is a big export here in Asia and is even making inroads in the West. Perhaps this rings a bell. There's also K-pop.
Wait, so
blockbuster
they
South.
blasted it across the wall. So I don't get it.
He heard it across the walls,
And then liked it? Like, I don't get it.
I feel like he would be mad about the fact that they're invading
They do.
his country.
I think he listened listen to it when all Olympic things are going on.
Hey, this
They
is
got
off
this.
topic.
They got this from me, actually.
Oh my god.
Well, it's Jib Jab.
Oh yeah.
You didn't know I could sing, huh? You just like paste your face or whoever's face you want
I
on
like
the.
doing it with my cats. 'Cause it was I know, this is like really bringing it back to me.
What year was this a thing?
I want to say like 2012 or
I'm so
2010.
glad.
It was out of fashion when we came back to the real world, so.
When you came back to the real world like two years ago. Yeah.
No, but when I was first sort of introduced to this.
This is off topic, but tomorrow in the cafeteria, some students here at the university are selling orange chicken for charity. So if you're hungry and have money, you should buy some.
I think that's abusive, though, to dye chickens orange. You know, they did that to a lot of chicks. They dyed them different colors.
Yeah, I saw that. Have you seen them do it? It's freaking I watched a video of it, and they literally just put them all in a bucket, and they get like a ladle, like it's soup, and just stir the chicks like they're soup while they're still alive. Yeah. Isn't that awful?
Yes.
My cat's pink though, so I can't really say much. I dye.
Oh.
Yeah, I have vegetable dye that I used to dye my hair with, and I had a whole bunch of extra, so I just like before I tried on my hair, I have her be like my little test dummy, but it's all like vegan and organic and stuff, so it's not bad.
Oh, he's letting us stir it around in a bucket.
Yeah.
So that ties in beautifully with phenomenology, because anything does, actually, because you're just describing how experience of dyeing hair and dyeing chicks, and actually orange chicken is a real menu item. But yeah, that's, you know, if you think of it, you know, it's kind of interesting, and it leads to the concept that by describing phenomena as different cultural groups experience it, you come to realize that the human experience is diverse, and what could make it diverse is the various cultural filters that people are using in order to see it, and as a result, we can then see why we end up with the socially constructed reality, that basically we've created society the way we wanted it, so to speak, or, you know, I mean, through this dialectical process. It's a human creation. But it is attached to a form of life, so I can't, you know, we can make tables, we can design tables because of the way we want tables, but I can't, once the tables are created, they're like concrete, like Hegel talked about. You know, the neat thing about the concrete that Romans invented is that you start off with kind of a slurry that is, you know, mixable and stuff. You add water and you know, mix it up to the right amount. Then you pour it into a mold and you let it dry over a day or so, and then you take the mold off, and now it's a rock. You know, so in a sense, we create these ideas, and once they become formed and set, then now they're rocks, and you can't just willy-nilly decide that tables don't exist, or that money doesn't work the way it does, or that property doesn't work the way it legally is accepted in different communities, etc. Right? So you get the idea of how this phenomenology works, and Husserl was pretty important that way. And there was the personal thing. He was Jewish, at least Jewish in genetics or whatever. And so when his student Heidegger became head of school. Mm. So Martin Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. He thought that since he was so intelligent, that by joining the party he could become an advisor to Hitler and basically control Hitler. Of course, relatively quickly he realized that was not to be the case, and he quit and hid out for the rest of the Nazi period.
Yeah, I was reading about him that a lot of his beliefs actually didn't line up with the Nazi Party. That it was more of a, to me, it seemed more of a political safety
Yeah,
move.
yeah. There was.
He kind
There's lots of ways of looking at it, and it's pretty clear. He was sent to prison. Well, I don't think he was sent to prison. I think he was. So he was elected rector of Freiburg. A year later, he resigned. But while he was there, he fired Husserl, who was his own mentor, and that's just like horrendous. And he did promote, while he was the head of the school, he did promote the idea that the academic community was the third arm of the Reich. You know, the army, the first, the Air Force, the second, and the academic community, the third arm of the Reich. So besides Nietzsche and his influence on Hitler and arguments over whether Nietzsche, you know, like Brittany Hughes would argue that there was no way Nietzsche would have supported Hitler, but that is a hypothesis because we don't. He was dead. We don't know. And his sister Elizabeth did try to make it seem like he did support the Nazi Party, but people treat Elizabeth as if she was a dodo bird and not brilliant enough to realize that her brother was way beyond.
Is he Jewish?
Who?
The man that you're talking about?
Nietzsche? No.
Oh, okay. I was getting it
No,
mixed
Nietzsche
up.
is, oddly, Hitler may have had some Jewish family members
Yeah,
in
I
his
heard
past.
about that. So, the Nazi Party adopted Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch. Do I have that right?
And the SS were all supposed to be Übermenschen.
Okay.
And yes?
So, did his sister kind of like try to say that he would have been in favor of the Nazi Party because they adopted his idea?
Oh?
Would that be why? Or was she just like trying to associate him with
Well,
somebody who was in
Hitler
power?
was clearly. I suppose it could be easily compared to like Trump right now. You know, so in a sense, you could say Elizabeth was very similar in ways to Trumpites. You know, and you would wonder, you know, would the educated elite agree with her? Probably not. But she was really impressed by Hitler and the way Hitler, you know, paid homage to her brother. She presented like Hitler's. She presented to Hitler Nietzsche's walking stick and stuff, and you know, and he ordered the SS instead of a pocket New Testament, they were supposed to carry Nietzsche's book. Thus, also sprach Zarathustra in their pocket, because he thought of them as all being Übermenschen.
What's Übermenschen mean?
Overman, Superman, the next,
The elite.
the
Sort of.
the next evolutionary step.
Mm.
Because in a sense, now the thing is, did Hitler understand it? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. Like, was Was he?
he doesn't seem to come across as that much of an intellectual. He was,
Because the Ubermensch idea wasn't about eugenics, it was about like people
academically
create their
understanding, right,
Okay.
exactly, yeah.
own. Okay.
And Hitler's definitely thinking of an Aryan race.
Right,
You know, the idea that they would create blonde, blue-eyed people, which Hitler was not.
Yeah.
You know, it was all kinds of screwy.
Weird.
You know,
Do you think that he actually believed that like the Aryan race is superior, or do you think it was just a part of his like agenda and like his like political agenda?
I suspect he believed it. But the thing is, that's today understood to be just nonsense, and that true genetic science teaches us that a blending of genes creates actually a stronger.
Yeah, genetic.
Yeah. When you, I mean, it's almost a joke about the British, you know, the nobility,
Incest
and that
thing.
if you just narrow the genetic source of the next generation, you end up with
Inbred.
passing on defects more so than creating a stronger gene pool.
Yeah, that's actually pretty like basic in evolutionary science, that genetic diversity is very like good to have in a society. It's crazy
Yeah.
that he didn't like realize that.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection though. Hitler and his party and others that he got their ideas from American racists that were responding to Darwin and the idea that there are these evolutionary races, and that you could, you know, have all these different skulls to indicate all these different types of humans, and that there was, of course, the best type of human, and Americans were very, very set on trying to keep the immigration into the United States primarily from Northern Europe instead of other places, especially not Jewish people. Even during World War II, when the Holocaust was happening, FDR refused to allow that famous ship
Right,
into the U.S. Because they were hostile to Jewish people. I mean, you know, and it was kind of an interesting thing in Ray Muck's book on Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer was the physicist who studied in Cambridge, studied with lots of different interesting folks, but was basically the administrator of the project that created the atomic bomb, which of course we end up succeeding. They had the first explosion in Nevada, right? Nevada? Yes, Nevada. Near White Sands, I guess.
Isn't that in New Mexico?
Yeah, somewhere in that area. In fact, there's an opera about it, Dr. Atomic. I don't know if I.
Except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me.
So it's like a mental exploration of the trauma in his own mind.
Wasn't it true that the guy who created the atomic bomb regretted it and felt awful about it later?
Some of them were afraid it was going to blow up the whole world.
Well, it's not too late for that.
They meant at that explosion. They didn't know what it was going to do. It's not a beautiful opera. However, are little tidbits like this interesting?
Yes.
But the interesting thing that I was going to bring up here is that there were different classes of Jewish immigrants, and the Oppenheimer family, which was Jewish, were wealthy, intelligent. They were upset because the New Yorker elite class wouldn't invite them to clubs and things. They didn't like them. But guess what? When the Eastern Jewish people did start coming into the country, they hated them. So there was like a continuous hierarchy because of cultural differences. They were dirtier, they weren't educated, they were crude. The Oppenheimers were elite, although they weren't acceptable in the Protestant elite communities because they were Jewish, right? So you get kind of an interesting, complex picture. Okay, so Heidegger, pretty interesting, ties in, obviously, pretty significantly. But so moving on to John Dewey. John Dewey is another example of American pragmatism, although he himself also referred to himself as an instrumentalist, with the argument that knowledge is an instrument. And while Charles Sanders Peirce was primarily a logician and a mathematician, William James was primarily a psychologist, physiologist, started out as physiologist and became a psychologist. But at the time, by the way, psychology and philosophy was not separated into different categories, departments, etc. In fact, you could say that at the point where psychology became its own department, philosophy then became its own department separate, and they actually went some separate ways there for a while. In a sense, of course, still philosophy is all of it, and psychology narrowed its scope to human behavior as individuals, whereas sociology is human behavior in groups, anthropology is human behavior in old, ancient history. So all these different, but in a sense, philosophy is still attempting to put it all together in one big picture, which I suppose makes us, what's the expression? We're a jack of all trades and a master of none. Does that make sense? I know to some extent there are folks that would argue that I'm totally wasting my time by being interested in everything. If I want to actually accomplish anything, I should focus on one narrow. And sorry, if anything, I feel like my focus is on everything. So if I'm curious about Galileo and Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and all those, I'll read Da Vinci. I'll read stuff about them, but I'll read stuff about current events. Why limit yourself? I cheat, though. I say that God is the one that kind of throws something my way. It's almost like the other day I read how Amy Schumer, that I mentioned Amy Schumer. She was,
Yeah.
yes, talking about how she was on her exercise bike in her gym. She's talking to her friend, and she says, "You know, I was thinking to myself, I've been screwing my boss now for so long, and he's still married. You know, I'm beginning to think maybe he's never going to divorce her and marry me." And then I saw this T-shirt in front of me at the exercise place, and it said, "Cool it," or something. And I realized God was just telling me, just keep screwing my boss. Yeah. So that's actually a sophisticated pun on people that think the universe is designed and pointing them in a specific direction. Amy Schumer, she's pretty gross, actually.
I know. A lot of people have a lot of complaints about her.
Well, I've seen some of her stand up, and it's like,
I know, isn't it just like, I'm a girl, I'm a vagina, ha 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 ha. Isn't that like basically it?
yeah, lots of vaginal humor. Actually, that's pretty impressive. I know the correct adjectival use for that, right? In any case, so John Dewey. I mentioned Charles Sanders Peirce, William James. John Dewey would be maybe the third most important of the American pragmatists, although as suggested there are lots of other ones. John Dewey grew up in Vermont, where he had several brothers. Oddly, even though he was the youngest, they all went to the University of Vermont together. And while he was there, he decided he wanted to become a philosophy major, although his teacher said, "That's dumb. You can't get a job as a philosophy major, when you graduate, unless you're also a minister." Because at the time, it was pretty much the case that all philosophy jobs, like at universities, went to individuals who were also ministers, theologians. The two were tied that closely. But actually, it was right at that time that there was a divergence in American universities, higher education, that split religion from philosophy. And universities split really from religion. So, that's an interesting book on the history of American education. Marsden. Isn't Amazon going to ask me, do you want to give to such and such? So, in this book, it's kind of like a history of the relationship of the university system and religion. Talks about how basically all the main universities, the older ones, started off as religious institutions with the exception of the Ivy. Well, even the Ivies, depending, like Harvard, was definitely a religious association in 1664, whenever the heck. Princeton was religious association. But Virginia, University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson, kind of a significant symbol was to put the library in the place where it was traditionally the chapel of the university. So he was an enlightened. The Enlightenment, instead of being religious oriented, it would be science. And so you could think of University of Virginia as an example of that split. Now, I mean, when I went to Westchester, we had a philosophy department. We did not have a religion department, although we did have classes in philosophy on religion. So philosophy of religion, Western, actually we didn't have a Western religion course, but we did have an Eastern thought course, which covered Zen and Buddhism and things of that sort. And by the way, today I keep track of what goes on at my alma mater, and they have way more classes associated with religion now, because religion is way more interesting for some reason to young students today than it used to be, especially exploring other religions outside of the typical Protestant Northern European traditions. Of course, the church schools are still associated. So if you go to a Jesuit college, guess what? The Jesuits are going to teach you about religion. But by the way, they're like the Marines. How we have Army, Marines. You know, the Marines are like the. I was in the Army, and I was always glad that we had the Marines, because if there was a hot spot, they would send in the Marines, and I was like, yay, you know, send in the Marines, you know, go Marines. I'll stay home and watch you from here, you know. That was, and in a sense, the Jesuits are like that. They're kind of like the Marines of the. They were part of the Inquisition. They were part of, by the way, Pope Francis is the first pope who was Jesuit, from the Jesuit. The orders are founded holy orders where you have to take vows to belong specifically to that order, as opposed to like being a priest in general, which are usually referred to as secular. I know we usually think, pardon?
That's confusing.
Yeah, well, that's because the word secular has become associated now with non-church things, but actually the original use of secular was because it's based on the second. So while the holy orders are associated with the eternal, dedicating their life to the eternal, the secular priests are associated with serving the parishes, where you're concerned with everyday life. So moment by moment, everyday life. So secular, we're associated that way. The idea that secular now is but I don't know. It must have changed over time. But they still refer to parish priests. You can go to a separate kind of seminary to become a parish priest, instead of going to a seminary that's dedicated to a particular holy order, where you're going to take the vows associated with the founder of that. And the founder of the Jesuits was Ignatius Loyola, but there's also the Franciscans, followers of St. Francis. There's also the Augustinians, followers of St. Augustine. Benedictines, Benedict, you get the idea, right? Clare, I don't know what Clare's, St. Clare, what order did she found? She founded an order too. Carmelites? St. Clare.
I love the patronages of saints.
Yeah, you
Like,
get the
who
weirdest
chose
things.
her for eye disease and laundry? Embroiderers? Why do embroiderers need their own patron saint?
Wait, where does it say that?
Under patronage. They're all that weird, though. Is the thing.
What the heck?
So it is in the Franciscan tradition.
Oh. So if you, depending on the order that you join, would you have to like give up certain things or do certain things differently? Like
If you join the order?
if you joined the Franciscan order or the Jesuit order.
There's a rule. The rule is like, those are the rules that you're accepting as you join that order. Almost all of them, I don't think the Dominicans are this way, followers of St. Dominic, but because they're a teaching order, I don't know. But most of them have the vow of poverty, silence, you know, there's all,
Silence.
yeah, like times of the day you're not supposed to talk.
Oh.
Things.
Wait, they're called Dominicans? Are they? They're not from Dominican Republic, though. They're just.
No, the Dominicans as an order.
That's confusing if you're from Dominica.
Yeah.
I did think the same thing. When I first
Yeah,
heard the word.
that's what it sounds. It's the same word.
So back to Dewey. Dewey goes to Vermont, gets his bachelor's in philosophy, and then goes to Johns Hopkins for his PhD. And as I was saying, the timing is absolutely right. He's hired immediately on graduation and goes and teaches at the University of Michigan as a young professor. After 4 years, life and works, Burlington, Vermont, surviving brother, Phi Beta Kappa, Johns Hopkins, his enrollment at Johns Hopkins. By the way, while he was at Johns Hopkins, that's when Charles Sanders Peirce was teaching there, teaching logic. Remember, before he got fired for having a date with a married woman. So, and George Morris, by the way, was another pragmatist at the time. Dewey received his PhD from the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins. In 1884, he accepted a faculty position at the University of Michigan. He joined the newly founded University of Chicago. Actually, there was some other, because he went from Michigan. He was there, I believe, 4 years? From 1884 to 88. Notice he comes back in 1889. That 1 year he had left and went to, I think, the University of Minnesota. And then the chair of the department at Michigan died, and they invited Dewey to come back to be the chair. And he did, and stayed till 94. But then he joined the University of Chicago. Notice he stayed there 10 years. And this is where he, besides, I guess we're going to get a lot of good stuff, but here he also invented the laboratory schools. So even at the University of Vermont, his main influence, philosophical, historical influence from his teacher was Hegel. And so he was into Hegelianism, and I'm sure how that developed historically. But what he does is he applies Hegel to teaching. He says, you know, as Americans, our main need in our school system is to learn how to solve problems. And up until this point, even though Hegelian philosophy kind of spreads, notice it has to have like a trickle-down effect on, you know, so it's a paradigm shift, but it doesn't affect everything else. You know, so it takes a while for it to affect biology, it takes a while for it to affect psychology, it takes a while for it to affect physics, and so on. Well, it also has to take a while before it affects education. And what we see here is the idea that the best way to educate students is not by just rote learning. And there's some beautiful YouTube videos of old videos of what the one-room schoolhouse used to be like. You know, we had these one-room schoolhouses where all the students in the community went together, regardless of the ages. So you've got high school and first graders mixed in the same room, and the teacher's basically going through the ABCs, the capitals of the states, you know, and it's all memorization by rote, you know, the most boring kind of education you can imagine. And what would be most interesting in it was reading texts. Remember, in the education of Henry Adams, which is a classic book. If you ever get the chance, you should read it. And it's online, by the way, so you don't have to buy it or anything. But Henry Adams was the son of John Adams, who was the president and friend and competitor with Thomas Jefferson. Right? Both of them dying on the same day, July 4th, 50 years after 1776, which, if you do the math, ends up being something. And they both died the same day. That's kind of cool. In any case, Henry was John Adams' no, I'm saying grandson, but it wasn't. It was because there was the actual son was John Quincy Adams. Sorry if I totally screwed you up. John Quincy Adams was John Adams' son, and Henry Adams was the son of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams also became president. I forget which one, pretty early, but he only had a 4-year term, because on the next election cycle, that's when we had the first shift to what we call a popular vote, and that's when Andrew Jackson was elected. So that's kind of intriguing. But when John Quincy was ambassador, I think, to France, John Adams, the one who would become president, was ambassador to France with, I think, or England, I forget which one. But meanwhile, John Quincy was sent as ambassador, the first ambassador to Russia. He was only 18 years old. And, you know, if you read his life, his biography, he goes across Poland in a carriage. You know, how would you get there? You know, literally, you know, by carriage, all that way, etc. And then, of course, all the way back. It's, you know, imagine an 18-year-old kid, basically the ambassador from the United States to Russia. Why would you
want an 18-year-old to represent an entire country? That doesn't sound
Well, I mean,
smart.
people like died way earlier, so 18 was like a higher standard of adulthood.
Well,
Still.
You had girls, you know, have babies at 16, and that was like normal. So
well, it was mostly because John Adams was already in Europe with his son as accompanying him as an assistant. And when they realized it would be great if they had an ambassador to Russia, they came up with the idea of sending John Quincy, because he was already there, so off he goes. So yeah, and of course he eventually becomes president. By the way, he marries a woman from England who becomes, I can't remember her. Why do I have trouble with women's names? I'm sorry. There's a biography on her. Louisa. She was not born in the U.S.
Whoa. That's an intense hat.
Pretty interesting, actually. There's a biography of her, too, if you're into biographies of... Yeah, Melania is the first since.
first what? Oh,
To
foreign
be
born.
from, yeah, foreign born.
Oh wow, that is interesting.
And there are biographies of her, relatively new, which are interesting because, you know, here's the biography of John Quincy, here's her biography, and you see the two of them, and they come together. So, Okay, so the laboratory schools are going to be different because he's using Hegel's dialectical process to apply it to the way you teach. And the idea is that education should be based on what he called the theory of inquiry. Which you've studied yourself, because that hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot.
That's just like the standard scientific method.
Exactly. So you start off with a problem that you want to solve, and you come up with a hypothesis. You do some, basic empirical analysis, right? But then you come up with a hypothesis, and then you test the hypothesis, and you find out if your hypothesis works and solves the problem or not. If it doesn't, you go back and reevaluate the problem. And notice that this is a dialectical process, right? So you come up with a thesis, apply tests, you keep going back and forth until you eventually solve the problem. And when you do solve it, remember that the concept of truth has changed, and they now have the concept of a warranted assertion. So for the moment, this is our warranted assertion, that this is the right hypothesis for now, right? Because we might eventually learn more information, and that is just absolutely amazing because we do. The world is like a fractal situation where each time you go down another level, you find a whole nother, it's like trying to dig to the bottom of the hole to see what the bottom of the hole looks like, Guess what? It keeps going, right? So that's kind of cool. So logic, the theory of inquiry, apply that to education, and guess what? You end up with the Dewey philosophy of education, which takes off and is appealing not just in the United States, but it becomes popular in Europe. In fact, people start reading his books in schools of education for teachers in other countries, as well as here. And part of the laboratory schools was to get parents involved in education, and John Dewey invented a little organization you've probably heard of called the Parent Teachers Association. Yes? Everybody's heard of that? Because parents ought to be involved in their children's education. So voila, there you go. School and society. By the way, he also famously, while in Chicago, visited Hull House with Jane Addams, 2 Ds, right? Let's go here. And she had quite an impact on him. It was in Chicago. This is the lake, I'm sure. It's also known as the Windy City. Have you ever been to Chicago?
I grew up pretty close to there, actually.
Oh.
We lived there.
I drove through and they wouldn't let me off the highway because I had a camper. And I was pulling a camper, and you were not allowed to exit with a camper until you got on the other side of Chicago. So I couldn't take pictures because I couldn't pull off. But we pulled off at Lake Michigan, and then again on the other side. So
I don't know if you want a camper through Chicago. It would be kind of rough.
well, we were driving to here. Right?
Oh, so-
I left Fort Meade, Maryland,
So you probably.
and we had a Ford Aerostar, a 1986 Ford Aerostar, and a Coleman camper, 15.5 foot by 7 hard body camper with 3 kids. And we loaded up our stuff, had the big thing on top of the van, had the VCR camera on the hump in the
Center console.
Yeah, yeah, and, you know, so that we could turn it on whenever the scenery looked interesting. With tapes. It was big. That was pennies.
The original
VCR.
dashboard.
Yeah. Pretty interesting.
They didn't let you go into Chicago with the
No, we could drive across, I don't know, probably this highway here. But we couldn't, there were signs saying no trailers, and so, yeah.
kind of makes sense.
But so Hull House was an experiment for homeless, poor people to learn about art. So she thought by letting poor people see paintings and learn music and stuff, it would improve their lives. She was eventually, I think it was FDR, wasn't it, that gave her a medal of she's the mother of social work. Nobel Peace Prize, 1931. And she had a big impact on John Dewey. But Dewey had a big impact on people all the way up until when he died in 1951. I was born in 51, so may have been interesting overlap. And we have so this is
To parent-teacher meetings goes many a bewildered old.
Now hold on, Miss Fox. It's all very well to teach my boy to paint pretty pictures and build birdhouses. He doesn't even know his multiplication table.
For generations, U.S. youngsters went to school because